I want to share a story. It's a very nice story about history of art, and it actually has a very interesting lesson after it. The open contest call in Florence was triggered by the Signoria of Florence, which was the governance body represented by the heads of the most important families. At the time, the Baptistery, which is the beautiful building, it's a hexagonal building that I'm showing on the left bottom, was beautiful. It was a medieval building. It was very symmetric. It is very pleasing to the eye. But as you can see in this picture, the doors of the baptistry were missing. And no, this is not a photograph from 1401. This is a photograph from the 20th century during the time when these doors were undergoing restoration. And they had wooden planks actually covering those doors. So I imagine that in the year 1401, a similar picture was showing. This beautiful building needed that little element to be finished. So they opened a contest for artisans and artists to actually submit their work and see who would get this very important commission. This would be a commission that would bring visibility, would create a name for whoever won, and most importantly, it was an important job, and it was a job that would secure an income for decades. This contest, however, was not going to be left to the imagination and to the creativity of the individual who was submitting their entries. They had very specific rules for this particular image. So it had to be one single image in a copper plaque. It had to be of a specific size, and it also had to have specific margins. Furthermore, the image that it should be depicting is Abraham at the time of the sacrifice of his son Isaac. There were more specific conditions. It had to be the moment of the sacrifice. The knife had to be on the right hand of Abraham, and Isaac had to be on at least one knee on the chest, ready for the sacrifice. This was not the only condition. There were other conditions for this entry. So, as you can see, the Signoria wanted to have sort of a common ground to be able to judge between the different entries which is the one that merits the actual winning of this commission for the whole doors of the baptistry. Florence in the Renaissance. The Renaissance did not begin on a given day, at a given time, on a given year, everywhere in the world. It is said that the Renaissance had different starting points in different European cities, and in particular in Florence, it seems to have been probably the first to manifest the characteristics that we now come to recognize as the Renaissance. And these characteristics actually impact the arts, the humanities, technological and scientific advances. So basically, what happened in the year 1400 is the absorption of all of these texts, classical texts that had been coming slowly from the East. And it was a rediscovery of classical texts, philosophy, arts, and science that had actually not been remembered during the medieval times. But the most important thing is probably the center of interest. The center upon the individual's intellectual potential, as I highlighted here, is probably a given in the 21st century. But think about the 15th century in Europe. They're coming out of medieval times. The center was definitely a religious sense of God at the center of everything. And the society was also key for the survival of the human beings and the different villages, etc. But now we're focusing on an individual and the individual's intellectual potential. Whereas in the medieval times, we see beautiful works of art, cathedrals, and stained glasses. We don't know who made them. In the Renaissance, we start identifying the artists by name. likewise in terms of scientific advantages. So this recentering based on the intellectual potential of an individual is characteristic of the Renaissance. And this is impacted in many different fields of science, technology, and the arts. And I'm going to be talking a bit more about architecture. So Florence at this time happens to be a hub. It probably was the witness of the beginning of the Renaissance, although it happened in other cities in Italy, probably very close to Florence. But in Florence, definitely, it was a powerful resurgence of this new movement and the adaptation of the classical texts to the 1400s. In addition, there were powerful families like the Medici who started actually providing a lot of sponsorship and actually helped a lot of this advancement of the arts, crafts, and technology and science that without that sponsorship, it probably would not have happened as it did in Florence. Europe in the 1200s was a very interesting place. And if you can see here, from the 1100s to the 1200s, there's growth, there's settlements. Of course, the fall of the Roman Empire in the 400s led to a lot of different tribes and different cultures growing during this time. Now, importantly, in the 1200s, the Holy Empire had been divided already. And as you can see in the east, it was basically Byzantium. It's in the pink, light pink color there. Byzantium was actually ruled by the Holy Emperor of Byzantium. It was a true empire driven by the emperor who led all of the important decisions and had all the power that were included in Byzantium. In the West, it was a very different story. The Holy Roman Empire of the West had actually been divided, and the Papal States, which you can see sort of in the middle of the Italian boot in the map, were very limited. The Pope did not actually rule over this Holy Roman Empire. After the Carolingian dynasty in France came from the Franks and they invaded after Charlemagne, he became the first Holy Roman Emperor after the fall of Rome. And what they established was basically that any head of state, of a Catholic, of a Christian, uh, estate nearby, any countries or estates, could actually apply to be the Holy Roman Emperor, besides being the king of their particular countries. So the example of Charlemagne, he was the king of France, he became the Holy Roman Emperor. This meant that he also had a very important power over decisions on the Holy Roman Empire together with the Pope. So the church and the monarchic estates were under this Holy Roman Emperor. In future centuries, we see how France, England, Spain, other different heads of the state applied for this particular role of being the Holy Roman Emperor, and they continued being the monarchs of their own countries, but having this additional role gave them a tremendous amount of power over the whole Christian world in Europe. So in this particular Holy Roman Empire, there are different states that are governed by kings, they're governed by emperors, or they're governed by Caesars, which take different names in different languages. They also can have princes or archdukes, and they all fall under the Holy Roman Empire. So even though they can make decisions on their own estates, they're overruled by both, the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. Whenever there's a dispute, the Holy Roman Emperor has that particular strength and power to make a decision. So now with the Crusades, which started in the close to the 1100s, a little before that, but the Crusades had established a new power. We have to imagine that the rulers of the state, it was usually the monarchic estates and the church and the people. They could be villains, they could be peasants, they could be, any other kind of arts crafts, but they were the people living in these different regions. They usually had a monarch, and they also responded to the church. Now, what happened with the Crusades is that you have usually younger sons of important families or any other kind of people that could go fight in the Crusades. They would come back not only with a lot of money from the booty that they would be getting in these territories that they savagely conquered, but also they brought texts and they brought knowledge and they brought a different way of looking at life. So they brought a different ideas of how things could actually work. And that gave them power. And when you have this additional power coming in, and they actually have been very, very important warriors, the monarchs and the church had to create another layer. The creation of knighthoods, barons, aristocracy, and the prestige of the families that had a crusader in their family was now becoming another layer that was important. And at some point, in many cases, what we see during this time is that sometimes this aristocracy, sometimes counts, could start having even more power than the kings themselves. An example would be, for instance, the Count of Anjou in the in the late thousand mid 1000, early 1100s. The county of Aquitaine, the dukedom of Normandy, they became extremely important, and because they had more territories, they started having more money than even the kings. So this started happening also during the Holy Roman Empire, and by the end of the 1200s, it created a lot of powerful divisions in the Holy Roman Empire. In the 1300s, the Holy Roman Empire ended up being divided because of all this power that had been driven by the different knights and barons with power and aristocrats that actually were able to create their own kingdoms or principalities. In addition, Europe suffered a little ice age in the 1300s. This caused failure of crops, and this also caused a lot of problems with decision making and with ruling this particular area. In addition, the plague or the bubonic plague actually came. It is said that it came from the Mongols when they were invading from the east. But Yersinia pestis got into Europe very savagely during the 1300s, and it killed a lot of the population. So there was a fracture of an established center that divided what before was a very strong Holy Roman Empire. Rome, actually around the Papal States, started accumulating mercenary armies of conquest. These were the peoples who in the past were actually providing support, military support, not only in the Crusades, but also to the Holy Roman Empire. And now they find themselves actually hiring themselves to the best bidder. So they're mercenaries. They're no longer belonging to Holy Roman Empire because that actually is divided. In Florence, however, what's happening is a little different. In Florence, what you have is the establishment of money banking systems. They followed the same idea of the Knights Templar, and what they basically did, different to the Knights Templar, was that in Florence, they realized with all of this fractured geography, all of this instability, there was a lot of crime, a lot of violence and insecurity. What Florence offered was sister banking systems around Europe. And they would say, if you leave my money with me, I will give you a note. This note is going to say that I have, I don't know, 10 pounds of your money. And that was weight, in there to see how much coin they would be getting. And they would say, I have this much weight in gold from you. They would give these notes to the people, and these people could go to the sister banking systems in the rest of Europe. This particular note was not useful if the person presenting it was not the person that was named in the note. So this made travel slightly safer. Even though they could be attacked, these notes were worthless if the holder of the note was not the person named in the note. So the Medicis, for instance, had their Medici banking systems. They would tell the travelers, this is where you can go. Now, how did the Medicis make money out of doing this? Well, it was not Christian, and they would have been excommunicated if they actually charged any interests for this particular sort of lending of their services. What they did was to charge a rent for keeping the money in their banks. So when the Medici had a particular weight of gold, they would say, I'm going to charge you 1% per month, or I'm going to charge you 10% of what you leave me here. When you come back, I will deduct that amount of money. And that's what I keep because I am renting the space to keep your money here. So these money banking systems in Florence are slightly different from the Knights Templar, who actually went out to the east and fought. The money banking systems in Florence were not crusaders. They did not go and fight, which is one of the reasons why there was a lot of politics and there was a lot of rejection from the crusader families in terms of the people like the Medicis who made their money just by banking systems without going out and fighting. Now, I want to quote Harriet Rubin's work when she says, the sword will become powerless against the thought and the florin. I really like this quote, and it really reflects what's happening in the times of Dante and, in the 1400s, how the thought and the florin were now starting to guide the power in Florence. I want to make a note of the Roman Empire of the East, Byzantium. It is starting to break also, although it is a bit stronger than the Western Roman Empire. Byzantium is also starting to fracture. In the 1400s, what we see now is that Byzantium has fallen. The Ottoman Empire has actually taken over and it's coming from the east, conquering towards the west. It's at the doors of Hungary, and it will eventually go to the doors of Vienna in the 1500s. But in the 1400s, the Ottoman Empire is expanding, and it is also finishing completely what was the Byzantium Empire or the Eastern Roman Empire. So we have only in the Western world, we have the fractured
Roman Empire, Holy Roman Empire. The Papal States are strong. They continue in the middle of the boot from Italy. France has been very strong throughout the Middle Ages, especially after the Carolingian dynasty was formed. And what you see in Florence is the establishment of the Medici power. The Medici family was a very strong family coming from bankers, but they basically acquired a lot of power because they also had not only money, but they had the learnings from the East. They were very focused in the science, philosophy, and arts. And with the money they had, they actually funded and they sponsored a lot of growth in this area. They could have done a lot of different things with their money, but fortunately for the world, I would say, they wanted to give money to the growth of arts, science, and philosophy. And that probably was one of the key points why Florence was the hub of this new movement of the Renaissance and why it took over before uh, other places in Europe. So the Renaissance comes a bit later in other places in Europe. Florence was then ruled by a signoria. Florence did not follow the same paradigm as having a king or a prince. And the signoria of Florence was typically formed of the heads of the principal families. And when the Medici became a principal family, was very contested by the Pitti, the family of the Pitti. They came from Crusaders. They had been established centuries before the Medici, and they did not like the Medici. But the Medici had a lot of power. They did have a lot of money, and they actually had additional power by becoming members of the Signoria, and they could influence the other members of the Signoria into the votes of what was going to happen in Florence. And the Medici wanted to build and to grow within Florence. They did not want to go out and expand their territories with mercenary armies. What they wanted was to make Florence beautiful, to make it grow, and to bring all the money into Florence for people in Florence. With this, in 1401, the Signoria of Florence wants to open a contest to actually finish the doors of the baptistry. So this is a photograph of how the cathedral in Florence looks now, and that's the baptistry. The baptistry is a building right across from the main entrance of the cathedral. In 1401, the cathedral didn't have the dome finished, so it actually was an open space of worship, and the signoria decided to first finish the baptistry. People continued to gather in the square across from the cathedral, and the baptistry was a very important building that needed just that final touch for finishing it, which were the doors. So the first project was completing that baptistry. To do that, they opened a contest, and they received different entries basically from Florence and Siena. This contest had specific conditions of the copper plate for each one of the individuals submitting an entry. So it had to be one single plaque, copper. It had a specific size and margins, and it had a series of conditions appearing in the image. So there was a little bit of a unified elements when they were going to compare one image to another. That's the reason why there's so many conditions to make the decision a little bit more on fair in terms of what they were comparing. The entries were going to be destroyed, and the copper was going to be reused. But fortunately for the world, history of art, and the world itself, uh, the two best contestants were saved and they can be seen today. The best two entries were Ghiberti's entry, and the second one was Brunelleschi's entry. And as I mentioned, the two of them have been preserved for us to see how difficult the Signoria had to make a decision between who of these two was going to get this very prestigious commission. So let's look at the two entries, and this is the fun part. I want you to cast 3 votes during this talk. Your first vote, I want it to be just by looking at these entries, and let's say it comes from your heart. Let's see what your heart tells you, which one is the one you would choose. This is Ghiberti, and head, side by side, this is Brunelleschi. So I'll give you a few seconds to choose, vote for yourselves, make a little note of it, and you'll see it's fun when I ask you for the second vote after I made a few descriptions. There is no right or wrong answer. It's just for you to keep it and to see if your vote changes or not during this talk. So I'll give you a few seconds. I'll just do a reverse count from 5 so that you cast your vote in a piece of paper or mentally. Ghiberti on the left, Brunelleschi on the right. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, so now you cast your vote based on what you see and what you prefer. Now I'll move on to some descriptions. Let's see Ghiberti's first. So simpler description of this image from Ghiberti, we look at what kind of composition this is. So this is a symmetric vertical composition. You can basically cut this image in the 2 halves, right and left. All the action is happening on the right. We read from left to right. So the left has the other elements that were needed, the 2 peasants, the donkey, the rock, and the tree. But the action is happening on the right. So when we read left to right, we know where our eyes have to stop. The eyes stop actually on the upper right quadrant. That's basically where everything, the narrative is telling us what's happening. Isaac has his knife on the right hand. Abraham has the knife on his right hand, and he's holding Isaac ready for the sacrifice while the angel is coming with the word of God to stop it right at the right moment. There had to be one image. One of the conditions is one image had to be rendered in a classical style. And this is what Ghiberti chose. He chose to have the very classical Greco-Roman sculpture of a kneeling boy as Isaac. So he fulfilled all the entries, conditions, and you can see in the narrative, as I mentioned, is a vertical symmetry, left less important than right. On the right is where you read the image, what this is telling you. And it's the upper right that carries the strength of the message from God, stopping it. This is very Gothic. We would say it's like a high medieval, high Gothic style. Again, very vertical. It typically from the Gothic styles, it leads your eyes to the top. So this is Ghiberti's entry in terms of reading it and having some description of it. Brunelleschi's entry in the description, when we start looking at what kind of composition this is not anymore a vertical composition like we saw with Ghiberti. This composition, it's actually circular. It takes our eyes everywhere. We start from the very strong elements on the left, we try to read it left to right, but we really can't read it that way. We have to go around in circles and see what's happening. The center of action is actually in the upper side, and most importantly in the very middle. It's where everything is happening. It stops you right in the middle. It doesn't actually allow your eyes to read from left to right. You come back to the middle in circles. In here, what we actually see also is that the classical image, or the image rendered in the classical style that Brunelleschi chose, is the boy that has this splinter on his foot. It's a very typical Greco-Roman image that we've all seen, but Brunelleschi brings it forward. He's not showing it to us in the typical classical way. Yes, this boy is taking a splinter, but we see the back of the head. We see a lot of the back in the shoulders. We don't see as much of the splinter in the foot. In terms of the composition is moving. It's uneasy. Brunelleschi has managed to put all of the elements that were needed, but he also added the sheep in there, which is the sheep that symbolizes the appearance of the sacrificial animal in lieu of Isaac. And that's the word of God. God says, you can stop it now. Here's the animal that you should sacrifice. So Brunelleschi makes a very complicated story. It's a moving, action-packed image. And furthermore, if you see here, Abraham has the knife on his right hand, and you can almost see it drawing blood from Isaac. Abraham is holding very strongly Isaac's neck. I mean, it's a very violent scene. And the angel brings the word of God, but it no longer has effect unless it actually pulls Abraham's hand from what he's doing. This is a very strong image, a very strong action. And the person who is actually doing it, it's centered on the individual. It's actually Abraham. Abraham is the one who has the strength here, the power here. And to stop him, the angel not only has to present the sheep and say, no, you have another animal to sacrifice here. But he's also grabbing the hand because the word is not enough. Brunelleschi's image represents a Renaissance image. This was new. This was something uneasy at the time, but it's a new world. It's the expression of this Renaissance sentiment of the individual power that we have, and no longer a passive vertical view and more easy reading. Brunelleschi makes you actually go around and see everything that's happening. With a brief explanation of the descriptions, I now want you to cast your second vote after these descriptions. Again, there's no right or wrong answer. Your vote could be the same or it could be different, but at least you are drawing now on slightly different elements to cast your vote. So I'm going to again count from 5 to 0. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. So now I'm going to give a little bit of an explanation of these particular images. Let's begin with Ghiberti. This image, very Gothic, as I mentioned, vertical. It has a vertical symmetry and it reads left to right. And it's a beautiful example of Gothic composition. In terms of how to make it, Ghiberti required 3 layers of copper to create this image. And the skills that were needed, again, this is the High Gothic. They've been doing this for many, many centuries. So it's not specific skills. and he does need to finalize the doors. They are going to take anywhere between about 9 to 27 panels each door. So this is something that is easy to project how much time it would take. The skills that are needed are not specific skills. Anybody in Florence who worked with copper could actually do it. So Ghiberti could find people to hire, finalize the doors, calculate how much time it was going to take, and put them on hinges so that these doors could open and close. Brunelleschi's entry. Again, you can see that movement in the clothes of Abraham that's full of action. You can actually see also the 3D composition. Even though in a photo you don't see that much, you can actually guess the two peasants, for instance, and also Abraham. They are really coming out. And Brunelleschi achieved this fantastic effect by using 9 layers of copper. So instead of 3, Brunelleschi is using now 9. And also, this is an unusual composition. This is very Renaissance. It's very difficult to achieve. The movement that he puts into the whole narrative of this scene is new. He would need to train people working in copper to make sure that they can achieve this level of narrative in the 3D images. So basically, Brunelleschi requires 3 times more material. So just in terms of material, is 3 times more expensive. Also, he requires to either train for new skills or get people who have a higher level skill than Ghiberti's. So in terms of the work, in terms of the salaries of the people doing this, it would also be more expensive. So this particular entry requires more money for material and people, but also it requires an additional level of complexity because of the weight, having anywhere between 9 and 27 of these very heavy panels. The hinges that normally would hold these doors of the baptistry would probably be having to be new kind of hinges, probably with the materials that they had and the way they used them. The hinges would have been breaking down frequently because of the heavy weight of the doors. So at the time, the question was, can we actually create these hinges? And if we can, it's an additional expense. So, taken together, we can make a lot of conclusions about which one has the highest artistic value, which one is more pleasing to the eye, which one would we like to have. But at the end, the explanation for your third vote is something that we all have to take in account when making a decision. So you are again the Signoria of Florence. Now you have the explanation after you saw the description of the 2 images, and I want you to cast your last vote. If you are the Signoria, who would you actually grant this commission to? Would it be Ghiberti on the left, or would it be Brunelleschi on the right? And I also want you to ponder, what was the element that helped you create or cast your first vote, your second vote, and your third vote? And what of these key elements do you think was important for you to feel confident with your final vote? So what happened is that Ghiberti got the commission. It's called Gates of Paradise because that's the narrative that they depict. And these are gorgeous. I recommend you to see Florence's Gates of Paradise. It's at the bottom of this slide. It's in a YouTube video on the restoration of these doors. The restoration was done not long ago, and it took 27 years to restore them. Interestingly, it took 27 years for Ghiberti to make them. It just happened to be that way, but now we can see them in their whole splendor as they were seen when Ghiberti first finished them. So, of course, Ghiberti got a very high, um, prestigious award. His name was everywhere. Everybody knew who he was. And as he was bringing these doors to fruition and putting them during those 27 years and beyond, everybody would know who he was walking on the streets. He was the great artist who made this. Brunelleschi, on the other hand, went on to severe depression, alcoholic binges of drinking, and didn't do anything with his life. Well, of course not. He didn't. He went on working great things and doing wonderful things. He lost this particular award, but he never stopped working. In 1418, if you remember, the dome of the cathedral, the cupola of the Duomo de Florencia, was not built. Somebody need to build it. And we now actually identify that particular dome with Florence. It's an image we have all seen one way or another, and that was actually done also by a contest. In 1418, the Arte de la Lana, which is the Wool Merchants Guild, this time was not the Signoria. They said, we have to hold a competition. We can no longer worship on an open space with the rain coming in and the leaves, from the trees coming in. We need to have our beautiful cathedral finished. The two main competitors, they were Ghiberti and Brunelleschi. Now, Ghiberti was very busy with the doors of the baptistry, and this time, Brunelleschi, his entry was worthy of the commission, so he won and he received the commission. So this Santa Maria del Fiore, the Duomo, the cupola is by Brunelleschi. So importantly, Brunelleschi did groundbreaking work doing this. In a way, we're very lucky that he didn't get the doors of the baptistry, because to build this Duomo, he actually created many new ways of building. He patented even ways to bring all of the materials high up as they were building it. He also created a series of pulleys to bring up the food on the lunch break to the workers, so that they didn't waste any time going all the way down and then coming all the way up. This was the tallest and largest freestanding Duomo since the last one had been built in the 400s, and it's Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. It took 1,000 years to surpass the size of Hagia Sophia's Duomo. And it is just an incredible feat of engineering that Brunelleschi did on his own by observation. He looked at the Pantheon in Rome. He also went to Istanbul. He looked at the different ways to do it, and he invented his own way. I recommend you to watch the PBS documentary on the Great Cathedral Mystery, because it was not only recently that people realized how Brunelleschi built it. And it's glorious. And if he had been won the other commission, well, maybe we wouldn't have this beautiful cathedral finished the way it is. So Brunelleschi did a wonderful thing. He was never ending, always working to improve himself, and brought a wonderful thing to fruition for all the world as World Heritage. To create this particular talk, these are the references that I recommend. Of course, there's many others, but I hope you enjoyed it and that you tune in to other of my YouTube channel videos. Thank you very much.